Okay, so my name is Josh Blouin, and today I'll be discussing what I am analyzing for my master's work, assessing moose habitat suitability and habitat selection in Vermont using GPS radio collar data and LiDAR imagery. So in early Vermont, when human survival was really a fairly constant quest for food on the landscape, the relationship of the people living here to moose was often that of predator and prey. And when early European settlers arrived into Vermont, they too were dependent on moose for a food resource, but they were also altering the landscape for agricultural reasons. And so this combination of hunting pressure and habitat degradation ultimately led to the extirpation of moose in Vermont by the late 1800s. Fast forward a bit to the 1960s, and the habitat in Vermont was evolving, and moose were slowly moving back into the state. Around 1960, there were an estimated 20 individuals statewide. Fast forward again to the early 2000s, and there were approximately 5,000 moose in the state. So the population really boomed, and that was primarily due to some forestry practice. So with this, this population exceeding both the social and the biological carrying capacity, Vermont Fish and Wildlife created a permitted hunt in the early 90s, which really ramped up in the early 2000s to decrease that moose population down to a target of 3,000 individuals statewide. This was successful, but biologists and researchers were noticing that the moose population continued to decline. And so they decided to really invest in their first ever moose research project in 2017. Oop, I missed my first picture. So between 2017 and 2019, Vermont Fish and Wildlife invested in researching the moose population by fixing 126 individuals with GPS and VHF radio collars in Wildlife Management's E1 and E2 in the northeast corner of Vermont. And the main objective of this study was to really examine mortality and productivity rates in the state. So why is the moose population declining? And for the past 3 years, I've been working on this project, and the main driver of mortality is winter ticks. And so these animals that are fixed with these radio collars, when they stop moving, we get sent an email that says mortality event. And unfortunately, we've had a lot of emails over the years. We go out to these sites and perform a necropsy on the deceased animal. And we're trying to determine cause of death. And almost always the cause of death is some complication from tick infestations. We have some individuals that have over 50,000 ticks on them. And I know that from actually counting ticks on a hide. So with this research, we're beginning to really better understand what mortality and productivity rates look like in Vermont's moose population. But in order to really comprehend this issue and make informed management decisions in the future, we need to better understand the relationship between the moose on the land, the moose and the habitats that they rely on in Vermont. And so what do we know about moose habitat currently in Vermont? We know that a habitat suitability index model, which is just a model that has pixels that are identifying really high quality moose habitat in the landscape. This was created by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the 1980s in northern Minnesota. That model was applied to Vermont in the early 2000s. And that model really informed, as it was the first look at how moose were used in the landscape, it informed management, but it was really based on assumptions from northern Minnesota and had several limitations at that time. And so what I propose to analyze for my master's thesis is, for my chapter 1, is to develop an upgraded habitat suitability index model for moose in the state. And my second chapter will be to examine the influence of habitat selection on an individual's health. So are unhealthy animals selecting different habitats than healthy animals? And are there any patterns there? But for today's talk, we'll really be focused on chapter 1 for time. And this will be that upgraded habitat suitability index model, so mapping moose habitat in the state. And that'll be based on 3 new sources of information that the first model in Vermont did not have access to. A big one is radio-collared moose. The first model didn't have radio-collared moose on the landscape. And so we have over 50,000 GPS points from those moose. We have access to contemporary land cover type maps and extremely fine scale LiDAR conditions, giving us an idea of age structure on the landscape. So the first step in creating this habitat suitability index model will be to examine the home range of individuals. And so in order to do that, these callers are sending a point every 13 hours for each individual moose. And so we'll have all of those GPS points identifying where that animal was in the landscape, and we'll identify with a 95% kernel home range this polygon of where they're likely to be on the landscape. After we've created that polygon, we'll then look at the utilization distribution. So these peaks and valleys, which are really identifying core areas of use within that home range. So you can think of it as your house, as being your home range. Where in your house are you likely to be? For me, that would probably be, I would have a big peak over my bedroom. And so why is that? And to get at that question, so we've created that UDD, to get at that question of why they're spending more time in one area than another, we'll use a resource utilization function, which is a mathematical equation that will essentially relate at any point on that utilization distribution, what are the resources underneath that. So for the example of the house and the bedroom, I'm spending most of my time there because I have a bed there and I sleep. So for moose, why are they spending time in one particular area more than another? And to really examine that, so enough of that, let's talk about lasers. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and this is an active sensor technology where an aircraft is flying over the landscape and shooting a laser down. That light is reflected back to the aircraft and really gives us this really dense three-dimensional point cloud with not only an X and Y coordinate as to where that aircraft was, but also a Z coordinate describing vegetative height. And so there's a cute little baby moose. The LiDAR will be an improvement over standard land cover maps because it'll really allow us to look at different layers of the forest. And when we study moose, we know that moose really utilize different forest age structures throughout a year. So what does this look like for one of our moose and our landscape here in Vermont? So number 44 is one of my favorite moose over the past 3 years. She resides in the Bloomfield Bowl. We really get to know these moose on an independent level. She resides in the Bloomfield Bowl, and we know from walking in there, this is a pretty productive moose area and has assumed high quality moose habitat. And so what does this look like in LiDAR imagery? And when we use LiDAR imagery, we get this really beautiful, very textured, dense, three-dimensional point cloud that's identifying the vegetative structure on the landscape. And if we zoom in a bit, you can actually see individual trees. If you draw a transect across this edge here, you can see the individual point clouds identifying structures on the landscape, trees, and as we progress east, we can see those points are concentrated closer down towards Earth's surface. So this point cloud really allows us to filter out height classifications that might be of interest for moose. So for example, the 0.2 to 2 meter height range, that's important not only for moose forage, but it might be important also for the winter tick habitat as they tend to quest, meaning they climb up vegetation and hope to cling to a moose at that height range. We'll also be interested in other height classification variables such as forage height or cover height or canopy, and we'll be looking at the proportion of those on the landscape. And so we'll use model selection to look at a combination of these different variables on the landscape and what creates the most suitable habitat for moose. So ultimately, what we expect to find is we'll create this map, and again, this is a map that will look sort of like this, where there are pixels. In my case, there'll be 10 meter by 10 meter pixels. And that will have a score, and that score will be identifying how suitable that is for moose. And so you can imagine the state of Vermont, you might have hundreds of pixels that have a score, and we can really kind of look at areas in particular and how important is that to a moose, which kind of gets at some of the ways that this information could be used. So different scenario models, changing climate on the landscape, how will that ultimately affect moose habitat in the state of Vermont? Forestry practices, how they either negatively or positively affect moose habitat, and human development. So with this model, we can really look at the landscape and say, okay, these areas are really pristine moose habitat. We need to avoid development in those areas. And the real big picture is everybody loves moose. Nobody wants to see moose disappear from Vermont's landscape again. And so my project is just one of a few that are really aiming to understand more about moose behavior, but also the relationship between moose and the landscape here in Vermont. So this project is funded by Vermont Fish and Wildlife, the USGS Vermont Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, USDA McIntyre Stennis Program, and the Rubenstein School. Some really crucial organizations allowed this project, this big project of using helicopters and capturing moose. Silvio Conti Refuge, Velco, New Hampshire Fish and Game, Maine Fish and Game. Special thanks to my advisors, Dr. Terry Donovan and Dr. Jed Murdoch, who are joined on my committee by Dr. Stephanie McKay, Dr. Katie Geeter, the moose biologist Cedric Alexander, my colleagues Jake DeBow and Elias Rosenblatt, and Tony Smith from the state and Steve from the Silvio Conti Refuge. So thank you very much. Yeah, that's a really good question. And for moose, it's really, they use very different places. So we have one moose, for example, that she wintered in kind of a wetland area, and in the summertime she would beeline it several miles to the top of a mountain to calf. And so, yes, we'll be looking at different seasons, and it'll likely be a growth period versus a dormant period. But yeah. Yep.
Would something take that from having the same impact on, say, like white-tailed deer or some other birds?
No, white-tailed deer are actually programmed groomers, and so they groom themselves pretty frequently and groom each other, whereas moose are, they kind of evolved without heavy ectoparasite loads, and so they don't necessarily know that they have ticks until it's pretty much too late. So, yeah, it's unfortunate.
Did the tick population proliferate because of the moose population, or like how?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's touching more on Jake DeBow, my colleague. That's more of his master's work. But yes, there are several theories as to why the tick population boomed, but one of them is because of a boom in moose numbers. So you kind of get this predator-prey reaction where you get this boom of moose, and all of a sudden there's a lot more hosts for a parasite. But certainly a changing climate also allows the tick to thrive.
So you're coordinating with New Hampshire and Maine, but how about Canada?
Yeah, Canada is, we just had the moose conference this past summer. They're certainly delving into this issue, but it's just difficult across, international border to, we actually had a moose die in Canada, which was, I don't mean to laugh at the situation, but it was quite a process to coordinate that and deal with that. But yeah, we've been in touch with people in Canada to figure out how to coordinate.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're actually out of time, so